All right, good morning. We welcome you here again. We want to go to 1 Kings chapter number 16 this morning. 1 Kings chapter number 6. Uh-oh, got a reverb or something. 1 Kings 18, I'm sorry. I don't have my glasses on yet. The 6 kind of looks like an 8. Anybody else have that problem? 1 Kings chapter number 18. Now I can see. All right. I guess when you start having eye problems, you go through the eye, and most of you maybe through the reading glass stage, and then you finally eventually have to get to regular glasses or contact. I'm getting close to getting glasses all the time, getting close to where I need them just about all the time to be able to see. I'm having to put them on a lot. So anyhow, we'll see about that. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 17 and 18 this morning. The title of the message is The Blame Game. The blame game, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in just a moment. It says, "And it came to pass," verse 17, "when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said unto him, Art thou he that troubleth Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house, in that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Balaam," or Baal. To me, this is one of the most amusing verses of Scripture, where Ahab and Elijah meet again after being apart for 3.5 years. And they meet again, and Ahab sticks his finger in Elijah's face and says, "There's that troublemaker." When in reality, the troublemaker was Ahab himself. It was not Elijah's fault that it hadn't rained for 3.5 years. In Israel. It was Ahab's fault and the people who did not follow God. And so Elijah didn't take it off of him. Elijah gave it right back to him and said, I'm not the one that's troubling Israel, you are. But in essence, what Ahab was doing here, which is what a lot of people do, they try to blame somebody else for their problems. And that's exactly what we see right here. Matter of fact, we're really good at being blame shifters, are we not? It starts early. It starts early. Remember when you were a kid. For some of you, I know that's a long time ago, so it's hard. But remember when you were a kid and your mama said, now, which one of you did this, or who did this, and what is the answer that many times the kids give? I don't know, or either he did it or she did it, right? I don't know. This I don't know mysterious creature. And all of a sudden something is different in the house. Something's been done. And all the kids are there and nobody knows. Or nobody fesses up. And they say, I don't know. Well, they're trying to blame somebody else. Now, we blame fast food restaurants for making us fat. We blame tobacco companies for giving us cancer. We blame presidents for hurricanes. We blame the church for lack of spiritual growth. And we blame God for the result of our poor choices. How sad that is. What is blame shifting this morning? Well, blame shifting is a denial of guilt. You don't want to admit guilt. It's the placing of guilt or blame on someone else. It's a distraction from the truth. It is a refusal to take responsibility. And I'm going to tell you, it's really an abusive practice. If you are a blame shifter this morning and that is your pedigree, that is something that you do on a regular basis, it's really an abusive practice. Are you better off if you blame shift? Are you better off? Are you really better off? What does it accomplish for you if you blame shift? What does it really accomplish for you if you want to shift the blame on to someone else? Well, there's two different groups of folks or two different people that we blame, or two different groups that we blame. Number one is we blame other people. We play the blame game with others. We blame others when it's something that is our own fault. All right, let's play the blame game here. You're driving 75 miles an hour in a 40-mile-an-hour speed zone. The policeman comes up behind you and turns on his blue lights and pulls you over and gives you a ticket. And boy, because you were going so fast in that speed zone, And by the way, don't raise your hand, but how many of you already had a speeding ticket this year? I can raise my hand. I've already had a speeding ticket this year. But it's all right. It's all right. But it's all good. So, John, I sympathize with you, okay? I sympathize with you over there. I wasn't going 75 in a 40-mile-an-hour speed zone, though. But anyhow, you're doing that, and then who do you blame for the speeding ticket? Well, if that policeman had been a little bit more sympathetic, or if my wife had been watching out for the cops, or if my wife had reminded me that it was we were going through Richmond Hill and we were supposed to go a little slower. She always reminds me, except the time that I get caught doing that type thing. You understand what I'm saying? So we want to start blaming other people when what should we do? We should take responsibility for our own actions. You pull through McDonald's. You pull through McDonald's. And you want some coffee. Now, I know they have cold coffee there, but we want some hot coffee, okay? We pull through McDonald's and it's morning time. We want a cup of hot coffee. Well, we're driving along and we're eating our Egg McMuffin or sausage biscuit or whatever, and we have the coffee between our legs down here, and all of a sudden it spills on us. Who do we blame? McDonald's. Let's sue them. And if you don't know the story, there's a lady that did that, ended up getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from it. It just blows me away. Some dumb jury gave her money for her irresponsibility. It's McDonald's fault for making that coffee too hot. Now they have to put on every cup of coffee you ever see, they have to put the word hot on there. How about this one? A man decided to try a stunt, swallowing razor blades. He ended up at the hospital in the emergency room. He ended up with a huge bill. Well, he took responsibility, right? He ended up suing the hospital for subjecting him to harmful radiation during x-rays. We live in a society today where it's not only acceptable but also profitable to shift the blame. But is it profitable and acceptable in God's eyes? It is not. Now, I will admit, it's hard for us to accept the blame for our stupidity, for our actions, for our thoughts. It's hard many times for us to accept the blame. It's one of those things that our sinful nature gives us that defense mechanism to keep us from honestly looking at ourselves in the mirror and seeing our mistakes and taking the blame. I've even seen athletes. These athletes who's making, lots of money, they blame their poor performance on anything and everything except themselves. I've seen a guy get up here and he's got a bat in his hand, and he's up here batting, and he goes, strike one, strike two, strike three. And then he looks at his bat and says, what's wrong with this bat? Well, it wasn't the bat that just made him strike out. It was him. And we want to blame our equipment, or we want to blame our teammates, or we want to blame our coach, or we want to blame the field, or whatever it is. We want to blame all of these things. We see it in politics. We see it all the time in politics, where they want to blame the other party, and this party blames the other party, and this party blames the other party, and they blame everybody else. They pass the buck on and on and on. We see it that husbands try to blame their wives for a lot of things. Some even try to blame them for their sins. There's a story in the Bible about that, by the way, Adam and Eve, which we'll get to in just a moment. Let me tell you something. Husbands, if you ever feel an inclination to blame shift on your wife, I want you to think about old Job. Think about the story of Job. When Job lost all that he had, his wife came to him and said, you ought to just curse God and die. What did Job say? He said, you speak like a foolish woman. God has given to me and God has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And the Bible says, in this, Job did not sin against God, nor charge God foolishly. He did not sin with his lips. Many times husbands want to blame their wives for all sorts of things. When it's their fault, it's their responsibility for what's going on in the home or what's going on in their lives. Now, I will say this, sometimes wives want to blame their husbands. And many times wives will blame their husbands for their irresponsibility and for things going on in their lives. And wives, it's time for you to take responsibility. It's time for husbands to take responsibility. I know sometimes husbands are not the most faithful Christians. But a wife cannot blame their husband's unfaithfulness for their unfaithfulness. A wife can continue to be faithful to the Lord, even if their husband is not. Matter of fact, Peter said this, likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they may also without the word be won by the conversation or the lifestyle of the wives. So that the wife can actually win her husband to the Lord by her lifestyle. I'll tell you what, a lot of people blame preachers for things. The preacher will say something in his message and people get offended by it. I've actually had people just even here recently. You know, I've preached a message and then they've never come back since then. Never come back. They get offended like that. Well, then they say, well, then somebody will say, well, why aren't you faithful to the house of God? Well, it's that preacher over there. Let me tell you something. Don't blame the preacher for your unfaithfulness to the house of God and your neglect of the house of God. Now, is the preacher always perfect? Does the preacher always say the right things? No, the preacher is not perfect, and sometimes the preacher doesn't always say the right things. Well, even that should not give you occasion to neglect your service for God. And it's really sad. But, regardless of the mistakes that other people make, we must remain faithful to God and don't blame the preacher. And don't blame another church member. Sometimes a church member may mistreat you. Well, don't blame that other church member for your lack of faithfulness or your neglect of the house of God. God's not going to stand for that. But we want to blame somebody else. Well, you know what they said or what they did. And then some people blame hypocrites. They say, well, there's so many hypocrites there. You know what I say about that? Just come and join us, because you're one too, whether you realize it or not. People try to blame their spiritual neglect on others, but I'm going to tell you they're still responsible for their sins. See, the blame game started way back in the Garden of Eden. Most of you know the story. Adam and Eve were made perfect. They were put in the Garden of Eden. God said there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil right here in the middle. Don't eat of it. Don't eat of it. Adam and Eve, we don't know the answer to this question, but Adam and Eve probably had hundreds of other trees to choose from. But there was one they couldn't eat. God was setting them up to see if they would just be obedient. They were not robots. They had the choice. They could choose whether to do right or to do wrong. Well, you know the story. They did wrong. Eve ate of the fruit, gave it to her husband. He ate of it. And then God came to see them. And what happened? God said, Adam, why'd you eat of the fruit? What did he say? It's this woman. It's her fault. God said, Eve, why'd you eat of the fruit? Said, it's that serpent. It's his fault. Way back in the Garden of Eden, the very first sin, we started the blame shifting game, the blame game. Adam blamed his wife, Eve blamed the serpent. Just think about that. And they started blaming somebody else, and guess what? It's been human nature ever since. And the thing about it is, you don't even have to lie to play the blame game. Adam and Eve really, in a sense, were not lying, because it was the serpent that came and enticed Eve, and it was Eve who gave Adam the fruit, and he ate of it. Okay? They were telling the truth in that, but yet what they were really doing in their heart, they were blaming the other for their sin instead of taking responsibility for their own actions. They did not say to God, yes, God, I did that. It is my responsibility. It's my fault. No, they wanted to blame somebody else. And boy, that's what we do. That's what Ahab did right here against Elijah. He said, it's your fault that we've got all these problems in Israel. When in reality, it was Ahab's fault. He was trying to blame shift on Elijah. See, Adam and Eve knew the rules. They knew the rules. They had it made in the shade, but they had a choice. And since they knew the rule and the consequence for breaking that rule, they were given fair warning. And therefore, listen, Adam and Eve were without excuse. They knew what was going to happen to them if they ate of that tree. And yet they wanted to blame somebody else. Matter of fact, you know what a lot of people do? We blame Satan. There was a comedian a number of years ago named Flip Wilson. You have to be about my age to know who that is. He was a black guy. He was funny in many ways, very funny. But he had this little routine going, "The devil made me do it." And, you know, that was one of his lines, "The devil made me do it." Well, and that kind of caught on. And so, you know, people now say, "Well, the devil made me do it." Or you know, the devil was on my shoulder here, whispering in my ear, and that's why I did that kind of stuff. Well, let me tell you something. Sir, does Satan entice us? Yes, he does. Does Satan tempt us to sin? Yes, he does. But who makes the final choice to sin or not? It's not Satan. So don't go around here blaming Satan for your sin, for your wrong. We want to blame everybody else instead of taking responsibility for our own actions. Adam and Eve had a choice, and you have a choice to obey or to disobey God. Go back to Exodus chapter 32, if you would. Let me show you another blame shifting time. Exodus 32. Verse number 1. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, he was up there for about 40 days with God. It says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. We don't know what's happened to him, so get up here, make us some gods that we can worship. Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons, and of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. Now Aaron is Moses' brother, if you didn't know that. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early on the morrow and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. Verse 7, the Lord said unto Moses, Go, get thee down, for thy people which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. Now, go down to verse 19. Moses went down, verse 15, and it came to pass, as soon as, verse 19, as soon as he drew nigh unto the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the table out of his hands, and brake them beneath the mount. And he took the calf which they had made, and burned it in the fire, and ground it to powder, and strawed it upon the water, and made the children of Israel drink of it. And Moses said unto Aaron, What did this people unto thee, that thou hast brought so great a sin upon them? And Aaron said, Let not the anger of my Lord wax hot. Thou knowest the people, that they are set on mischief. For they said unto me, Make us gods which shall go before us. For as this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. And I said unto them, Whosoever hath any gold, let him break it off. And they gave it me. Then I cast it into the fire, and there came out this calf. That again is one of the most amusing verses of the whole Bible. I threw it in there, and then out came this calf. Now, if you read that story good enough, you saw that Aaron is a good blame shifter. He did wrong. You know, when the people come to him and say, Up, make us gods, what should Aaron have said to them? You people are crazy. I'm not doing that. We're going to worship the true God, Jehovah God. But then he said, Okay, Bring me your gold. Well, if you read the story good enough, he blamed the people. He said, you know these people? They're bent on mischief. They're depraved. They're sinful. They're good for nothing. And really, he blamed Moses. He said, what's wrong with you? You've been gone too long. If you hadn't been up there in that mount, this would not have happened. And then he blamed, again, the furnace or the fire. He said it was the fire's fault. And so here we got a professional blame shifter saying, hey, these people wanted a God, and you know how they are. What was I supposed to do? You were gone. It's your fault. You were up on that mountain all this time. Don't you blame me. In fact, blame the furnace, the fire, because all I did was throw the gold in there, and out came this calf. Someone has said, what a tangled web we weave when our desire is to deceive. Here's another way we play the blame game. We get caught at something. And our first response is, I wonder who told on me. I wonder who told on me. Instead of accepting responsibility, what do we want to do? We want to know who blew the whistle. As if to say, well, if they hadn't told on me, I wouldn't be in this mess. No, if it weren't for your actions, you wouldn't be in this mess. And we blame, listen, this is what happens. We blame someone for doing the right thing when we have done the wrong thing. And I'll tell you somebody else that gets the brunt of blame shifting, and that's parents. Now, I'll admit, parents are very important in a child's life, and parents have a big influence on a child. And I understand that sometimes parents are the sorriest things on the face of the earth. I understand that. But praise God, I'm going to tell you, some of you here this morning have got wonderful parents, and you need to thank God for them. You ought to praise God for them. But I'll tell you this much. Do parents have an influence? Do parents guide us and lead us in a certain way? That's exactly right. But I'm tired of this idea. So everybody, and this is Freud that wants to take everything back to your childhood and blame all of what you're doing right now on your childhood. And I got news for you. Sure, has it impacted you? Yes, it has. But there comes a time where you have to grow up and accept responsibility for your own actions. And quit blaming mom and dad. I'm going to tell you right now, you may have a godly mother and father and turn out to be a reprobate. You may have an ungodly mother or father, but don't you blame them for you not accepting Christ and following Him. You can make up your own mind. You can make up your own mind. But boy, we're good at blaming parents. And again, that's the psychology of our day. You know, that we want to go back and find out what happened in your childhood. And you hear all these movie stars, finding all this stuff out. And listen, I understand. Listen, when people are abused as children, I know that is tremendous impact. I am not minimizing any of that, but I'm telling you right now, with God's help, you can get beyond that. You can get above that, and you don't have to blame anybody anymore. You can be so much stronger and so much better than anyone else could be. And we want to blame people. We want to say, well, it's your fault that I hollered. It's your fault that I did this. I know people who are unemployed and they can't hold down a job. And they want to blame everybody else but themselves. They go from job to job to job to job to job, and it's always the boss's fault, or always an employee's fault, or always somebody else's fault. Or people who were thrown out of college. And they want to blame everybody else instead of taking responsibility for their own actions. We want to blame the boss, or we want to blame the government. We want to blame parents. We want to blame all this and that and the other. We play the blame game. Ahab played it. Aaron played it. Adam and Eve played it. We see it in the Bible where people blaming other people when they should have taken responsibility for their own actions. Which brings me to the second thought this morning. We play the blame game with God. We play the blame game with God. Let's go back to Adam and Eve for just a moment. Think about Adam and Eve. Okay, they sinned. God came to them. Adam, what'd you do? Why'd you do it? It's this woman's fault. Eve, why'd you do it? It's the serpent's fault. Now, underlying to that, underneath that, what are they really saying? Think about it. What are they really saying? And really, Adam even said this. He says, the woman thou gavest me. What are they really saying? God, it's your fault. Adam said, if you hadn't gave me that woman right there, I wouldn't have done it. Why are you husbands laughing for? I don't know. That's always husbands laughing at. And then the wife, Eve, she said, if you hadn't brought that serpent around or hadn't made that serpent right there, I wouldn't have done it. And think about this. I guarantee you this was in their mind. If you hadn't put that tree right out there. We want to blame God. We want to blame God for all of these things. Let me tell you something. It is not God's fault. God even talks about that over in the book of James. He talks about how that it's your evil desire that causes you to be dragged away into sin. And it's not God's fault. There's people who blame God and say this. Well, God, if I had more money, I'd tithe. If I had a car, I'd find a job. We blame God for not dropping things right into our lap. We say, God, you're supposed to make this easy for me. God, I tried a couple of times and nothing happened, so I guess you don't want me to succeed. Or God, I've tried to wait, but you're not moving fast enough, so I guess I'll have to do it myself. I don't like the way you're doing things, God. You're to blame for all of my issues and all of my ills and all of my problems. Isn't it true that we are so quick to blame God when things go wrong, but we are so slow in thanking Him when things go right? And I got news for you this morning. You got a whole lot more things going right in your life than what's going wrong. But boy, we are good. It's just that old human nature, but we can overcome that. People even say, well, God, why do you allow so much evil in the world? And it's like, they're trying to find out the answer, but in reality, they're accusing God of causing all the evil in the world. Let me tell you something. It's the sin of mankind that's causing all the evil in the world. And really, we should look around the evil in the world, and we should not say, God, why did you cause this? We should say, God, thank you for it not being worse. And you say, what in the world do you mean by that? Well, you remember that Satan came to Job and said, you've blessed Job. Satan came to God about Job, I should say. Satan came to God about Job and said, God, you have blessed Job down there. You put a hedge around him. I tell you what, you take that down and you let me get to him and he'll curse you. God said, okay, but you can only go so far. Think about that. God does allow some of this. It's not Him that causes it. He allows it. But let me tell you this. It's only so far. We should thank Him that it's not any worse than what it is. Well, people think I can play the blame game and that's going to make me feel better and make everything better. Let me tell you something. It makes things worse. It makes things worse. When we blame other people, we are refusing to take responsibility for our own actions. And you know what that causes? That causes lack of growth in your Christian life and in your life in general. There are people today, listen to me, that will go through the day today. They'll wake up tomorrow and go through the day tomorrow and go through the day Tuesday and Wednesday and blame everybody else for all the ills that goes on in their life. And that's sad. They'll never amount to anything. They'll never amount to anything. They'll always, in essence, be a loser. they'll never grow. It's when we take responsibility for our own actions. Let me tell you something. Quit blaming God. See Him correctly. See Him for a God who does love us and that He does want us to live a holy life. And there's no room to blame shift other people, and there's no room to blame shift God Himself in our lives. Don't say this, well, it's not my fault. Look at what everybody else is doing. Or it's not my fault, they pressured me. That's one of the lines people use. It's not my fault, they pressured me. Let me tell you something. You get in a situation where people want to pressure you, you just run the other way. You think about old Joseph. Miss Potiphar, let me tell you something. Miss Potiphar pressured that young man. She put the pressure on him. We can't even imagine the pressure that was placed on Joseph. But you know what? Joseph was a man of God, and he said, I am not going to hang around for this. He ran for the hills. Even, she was grabbing at him as he ran and grabbed his coat off of him. And then she lied about him and accused him, and he spent some time in prison, but then God elevated him. So if people are lying about you, by the way, just continue to do right. God will take care of it. You just continue to do right. You can't say it's my fault they pressured me, or you can't say it's my fault they left me no way out. No, there's always a way out. The Bible says there is no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will also make a way to escape that ye may be able to bear it. The crux of the message is this morning, Ahab, quit blaming Elijah. Take responsibility for your own actions. Aaron, quit blaming the people. Quit blaming Moses. Quit blaming the fire. Take responsibility for your own actions. Adam, quit blaming Eve. Take responsibility for your own actions. Eve, quit blaming the serpent. Take responsibility for your own actions. Adam and Eve, quit blaming God. Take responsibility for your own actions. This morning, I wonder, is there maybe an area of your life that God has spoken to your heart through this message and said, I'm going to quit this blame shifting? Maybe it's a husband-wife situation. Maybe it's a parent-child situation. Maybe it's a job situation. Whatever it is, that I am tired of blame shifting. I'm going to take responsibility. And one final word here this morning. If you're lost and you do not know Jesus Christ as your Savior, you're not going to be able to stand before God one day and blame a preacher, blame a Christian, blame a co-worker, blame your mother or your father or anyone else. It's going to be just you that has to stand before God and accept responsibility for your actions. If you're lost here today, a lot of people say, well, again, it's the hypocrites in the church, or it's the preacher, or it's another Christian that I know, and this and that and the other. Let me tell you something. That's not going to fly with God. That is not going to fly with God. You are personally responsible for your rejection of Jesus Christ. People say, well, it's the church's responsibility that I'm not a good Christian. You can be as close to God as you want to be. It's the church's responsibility that I'm not saved today. No, it's not going to fly before God. You're personally responsible for your actions, and one day, every one of us is going to stand before God, either at the Bema Seat judgment or the Great White Throne judgment, and guess what? There's not going to be any blame shifting going on then. It's going to be allowed. You can try it all day long. You know what God's going to do? He's going to bring out the truth. He's going to bring out the truth that you're responsible. Heads are bowed and eyes are closed, if you would, this morning. Just a really kind of a simple message this morning from the study of the kings, Ahab and Elijah, the story.